Welcome to LexTalks, legal topics simplified. We're breaking down complex legal issues, making them clear and understandable. Today, we're diving deep into war crimes.
It's a heavy topic, but an important one, especially for you, our law students listening in.
Exactly. We're going to unpack what exactly constitutes a war crime, how these trials work, and look at some of the biggest examples, like Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II.
Those trials really set the stage for how we think about justice for these kinds of atrocities, even today.
So let's get started. What exactly is a war crime?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than you might think. It's not a static concept, it's evolved over time.
You mean it's not like there's one clear definition that's always existed?
Right. I mean, think about it. Back in 1474, you had the trial of Peter von Hagenbach.
Never heard of him.
Well, he was the first guy ever held accountable for what his troops did, a very early example of what we might now call a war crime.
Wow, 1474. That's way before, like, the Geneva Conventions, right?
Exactly. But it shows that even way back then, people had an idea that some things in war were just wrong.
So how did we go from that to something like the Geneva Conventions?
Well, over time, things got more codified, especially after the horrors of the World Wars. The Geneva Conventions really laid out what you can and can't do during war.
Okay, so the Geneva Conventions, they're like the rule book for war.
Pretty much. Things like how you treat prisoners of war, the wounded, civilians, all that's covered. Break those rules, you're committing a war crime.
So it's not just about, like, one person doing something violent. It's about breaking these established rules.
Right. And then there are things that happen outside the battlefield, too, like crimes against peace or against humanity. Often these are committed against a lot of people on a huge scale.
Like what we saw in World War II. So what exactly are crimes against peace?
Think of it like this starting a war that's not justified, that breaks international agreements. That was a big focus at the Nuremberg trials.
Ah, Nuremberg. That's where they held the top Nazis accountable for, well, everything, right? The Holocaust, other war crimes.
Exactly. It was a turning point. They established that individuals, even powerful leaders, could be held responsible personally for these kinds of crimes.
So no more hiding behind, I was just following orders.
In theory, no. Nuremberg wanted to set an example, deter future atrocities. One thing that's really interesting about Nuremberg is how they used evidence. They used a ton of captured German records.
So they weren't just relying on people's memories or stories.
Right. They had actual documentation of what the Nazi regime had done, proof of the brutality. It must have been pretty disturbing to uncover all that.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
And not everyone at Nuremberg got the same punishment, right?
Right. There were death sentences, life in prison, even some acquittals, and of course there were criticisms. Some people called it victor's justice.
Meaning that the winners were just punishing the losers, not really seeking justice.
That's the argument some people made. But there's no doubt that those trials changed international law and how we think about responsibility for these crimes.
They kind of paved the way for how we handle these things today, didn't they?
Absolutely. But Nuremberg wasn't the only one. Don't forget about the Tokyo trials happening around the same time. They dealt with Japan's leaders and what they did during the war.
So similar to Nuremberg, but focused on the Pacific Theater.
Right. They had to figure out how to hold people accountable for essentially tricking Japan into war. It was a massive challenge.
I bet. What happened there?
Well, 28 Japanese political and military leaders ended up before the tribunal.
That must have been a lot to handle.
It was. And these trials had General MacArthur overseeing everything, which raised a lot of eyebrows. Was it real justice or more of that victor's justice idea?
I see. So both Nuremberg and Tokyo, while groundbreaking, also brought up a lot of tough questions about international justice.
Definitely. And both played a huge role in shaping how we deal with war crimes today. They pushed the idea that individuals are responsible, and that's huge.
It's amazing how trials from over 70 years ago still have such a big impact today.
Their legacy lives on. Individual accountability, the importance of solid evidence, the struggle to achieve justice after a war, these themes are all relevant today.
We keep saying groundbreaking, but I do want to bring up something. There were criticisms of Nuremberg and Tokyo.
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about these trials without acknowledging that. It was a complicated time right after a devastating war.
Yeah. I think the biggest one I hear is that it was victor's justice. Basically, the Allies just punishing whoever they defeated.
That's a valid concern. I mean, the Allies created the legal frameworks for these trials, like the Nuremberg Charter, the Tokyo Charter, so that raises questions about influence on the outcome.
So some people argue that the trials were biased from the start.
Yeah, that's one argument. And then there's the whole thing about crimes against peace. That was a big part of both Nuremberg and Tokyo, but it was a pretty new idea back then.
Meaning it wasn't really established in international law before the trials.
Right. So some argued it was unfair to hold people accountable for something that wasn't technically a crime when they did it.
That's tough. Like, is it fair to punish someone for something that became a crime later on?
It's a huge debate. Legal scholars are still arguing about it today. You have this desire to hold people accountable for horrific acts, but you also have the principle of legality. You should only be punished for what was actually a crime at the time.
Right. It makes you think about how law evolves and how we deal with those gray areas.
Exactly. Nuremberg and Tokyo were really important, even if they weren't perfect, because they forced people to confront these tough questions.
And it wasn't just about the big guys, right? There's the criticism that these trials focused on the leaders. But what about the people who actually did those awful things?
Right. Some people felt it was more about going after those in power, and that the lower ranking individuals who actually carried out the atrocities didn't get enough scrutiny.
It's like for trying to figure out where the line is between holding leaders accountable for decisions versus those who followed orders.
That's the heart of it. And it ties into the whole idea of command responsibility, which was a big deal in both Nuremberg and Tokyo.
So the idea that commanders can be responsible for what their soldiers do, even if they didn't specifically order it.
Exactly. But of course, defining that, especially in the chaos of war, is really difficult. Nuremberg and Tokyo set precedents there that we still use today, even if they're tricky.
I'm starting to see why these trials are still so relevant. They weren't just about punishment. They shaped how we think about justice on a global scale.
Exactly. They had flaws, for sure, but they really pushed international law forward. They helped solidify that individuals are responsible for these crimes no matter how high up they are.
And that led to the International Criminal Court, right? The ICC.
Right. It's a permanent international court, deals with things like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, even the crime of aggression. It came about in 2002.
So it's kind of like the legacy of Nuremberg and Tokyo, but a more permanent solution.
I think of it as taking those ideas and making them concrete. Instead of setting up special courts after every conflict, there's a standing court ready to go.
Wow. So it's like saying no matter where you are, no matter how powerful you are, you can be held accountable.
That's the goal. Of course, the ICC has its own challenges, but just its existence shows how committed the world is to ending impunity for these crimes.
It's heavy stuff. We're talking about law, but these aren't just theories, are they? These were real people, real victims, real suffering.
You're absolutely right. We can't lose sight of the human cost. It's easy to get caught up in the legal arguments, but ultimately, these trials were about exposing the very worst of humanity.
And the impact that has, not just on individuals, but on whole societies. The trauma, the broken families, the scars that war leaves behind.
That's part of it, too. But it's also about the strength of those who sought justice, the courage to speak out, the determination to prevent these things from happening again.
It's a reminder that these issues matter, not just for lawyers, but for everyone.
Absolutely. It's about remembering the past, but also using it to build a better future.
So let's talk about that. How do these ideas, these precedents, apply to the world today? Because sadly, war crimes haven't gone away.
That's a great transition, because we can't just leave this in the history books. What does all this mean for you, our future lawyers, as you enter this field?
It's one thing to learn about Nuremberg and Tokyo, but how does it connect to what's happening now? Because war crimes are still happening, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And it's not getting any simpler. Think about everything that's changed. We have new types of conflict, non-state actors, terrorism, even cyber warfare.
Things that wouldn't have even been imaginable back when they were holding those trials.
Exactly. So the challenge is, how do we apply these principles to a world that's so different? Maybe even need to come up with new principles.
It's like we have this foundation, these precedents, but we have to keep building on them.
Right, and that's where you all come in. You're the future of international law. You're the ones who'll be shaping how we define and address these crimes in this new world.
It's a lot of responsibility, but it's exciting too, right? To be on the front lines of something so important.
It is. And it's not just about knowing the law, it's about understanding the world.
We talked about victor's justice before. How do we make sure that doesn't happen today? That international justice is actually fair?
That's the core of it, isn't it? It's about making sure everyone gets due process, that everyone's rights are protected, and that it doesn't look like we're just targeting specific people or countries.
So it's about strong courts, clear rules, transparency.
All of that. And also understanding that politics always plays a role. We have to be aware of that, make sure justice isn't being used for political gain.
It's complicated. It's not just about knowing the law, it's about understanding the whole context.
Exactly. You have to see the bigger picture, the history, the different perspectives.
It sounds like international law is as much about ethics and critical thinking as it is about the actual laws.
I'd agree with that. It's about wrestling with those big questions. What is justice? What are the limits of law? How can we use law to make the world better?
Those questions have been around for a long time, and they're more relevant than ever.
They are. From Nuremberg and Tokyo to today, they're at the heart of everything we're talking about.
So much to think about. We've gone from, what, the 1400s to the ICC today? A lot of ground covered.
It really shows how much international law has developed, but also how those early trials like Nuremberg and Tokyo are still so relevant.
Okay, so for our law students, those future legal eagles listening, what are the big takeaways here? How do we take all this history and apply it to the world today?
It's a great question. I think the biggest thing is remembering that international law matters. It might feel kind of theoretical sometimes, but it's the best tool we have to hold people accountable, even during war.
It's about setting those boundaries, saying even in the chaos of war, some things are just off limits.
Exactly. But those boundaries, those lines, they're not fixed. We talked about all the new stuff. Terrorism, cyber attacks, groups that aren't even countries waging war.
Right, stuff that totally changes the game.
And that means we have to be flexible, maybe even come up with new rules sometimes. You can't just take what worked in 1945 and apply it to everything.
So it's about building on what we have, but also being ready to adapt.
Exactly. And that's where your generation comes in. You guys are the ones who will be defining what international justice looks like in the 21st century.
That's pretty exciting. But also kind of daunting. I mean, we talked about the whole victor's justice problem. How do we make sure international justice today is truly fair?
That's the million-dollar question. It's about strong institutions, right? Courts that are independent, transparent, with clear rules. Everyone gets a fair trial no matter who they are.
It's about protecting people's rights, even when they're accused of terrible things.
Exactly. And we can't be naive. We have to remember that international law is always playing out against this backdrop of global politics. Sometimes countries try to use it for their own advantage.
So lawyers working in this area need more than just legal knowledge. They need to understand the whole political landscape.
100%. It's about seeing the bigger picture, the history, all the different sides of the story.
It sounds like this area of law is really demanding, not just intellectually, but ethically, too.
Oh, absolutely. You're dealing with the toughest questions out there. What is justice? Can law actually make the world better? Where do we draw the line?
Big questions, but they have real consequences for real people.
That's what makes it so important. And it's not just theoretical. We're seeing these questions play out right now all over the world.
Well, we've certainly given our listeners a lot to think about today. From those early trials to what's happening right now, it's clear that war crimes and international justice are more relevant than ever.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope everyone listening will keep learning about these issues, keep asking those tough questions, because you are the future of this field.
It's an ongoing challenge, this pursuit of justice on a global scale, but it's a challenge worth fighting for. So thanks for joining us on LexTalks.
Keep exploring the world of law, keep pushing for a more just world, and we'll see you next time.